In Chapter 2, we'll be setting up the control objects for the character. There are many different ways of setting up control objects using all kinds of different objects in Max. Many people use dummy objects or point helpers or other helper objects to create their controls. I prefer reserving these objects for the underlying IK systems, FK systems, and basic structure of the rig. I prefer using spline objects as my controls, as you saw. This way that I can filter for them separately in the scene from all the other objects. I can hide by category, unhide by category, and be able to get my shape objects always filtered out. It's rare that any final objects in the scene will be shapes unless they're just renderable splines. In this case, I can put an edit mesh on top of them to actually make them show up as geometry. I prefer using nice little round control objects, sort of handles, to be able to grab and select on screen. If the animator always has to dig inside the character to find a bone to be able to rotate it, it becomes very difficult for them once the character isn't transparent to know what they're grabbing and trying to grab different pieces. So for control objects, in this case, I'm going to start with a circle, and I'm going to create the main control around the waist. This is going to have to be quite a large one for this character. I'm going to right click on my move tool, pull my type in transform, make sure it's zeroed and it isn't just guessing side to side. And then I'm going to place it up to about where I think the center of mass is. The placement of this control is best where the most mass is in the body. Think of it this way: if the character were to jump up and do a backflip, about what portion of the body would they be rotating around? I find that this character is probably right about there. To make my shapes a little easier to select on screen, go into the render settings, turn on display render mesh, which will display the render mesh. And so that I'm not taking a lot of viewport cycles just to draw it, I turn the settings all down really low. Sides down to 3, so I get very few. In your interpolation, I turn this down to 3 as well. This gives me a very low quality handle to grab. You can adjust the thickness of it as well to make it easier to grab or see, so you can actually bias some to say that this control is the main important one, and I'm going to leave it quite thick so it's easy to grab. I also usually work with a very specific color coding for my character's control objects. All the main controls up the spinal column get a deep blue color. This way they're easily identifiable if you have many characters on the screen. For the controls for rotating, I'm going to create the same kind of controls you saw on the initial rig that I showed. Easiest way to do that is just 3 circles linked together. I'm going to build this in the top viewport again so that I know that the pivot of the object is aligned to world space. Make sure it's in center side to side. My rotate, I'm going to turn on angle. Angle snap. And rotate them 90 degrees. Select the original. Convert it to an editable spline through the Convert to Quad menu. Choose the Attach and attach the other 2 splines to it. Now I have a nice little circle control object. Once again, I'm going to color code this one the deep blue because it's going to be up the center. You could make it another color blue, saying, well, these are the body ones as opposed to the main waist one. However you decide to use the color coding. Now that we have a control object created, we can copy this around the character and use it where we need. We will start with the lower waist, or the hip controls. This control will control this bone here, and actually have a bit of a twist effect going up the spinal column once we're done. It looks a little large to me, actually. So what we're going to do is we're going to scale it down into size, make it a bit smaller so it doesn't stand out as much. As I said previously, you should never scale an object at the object level. This can cause changes in the transform matrix and will cause problems later. The best thing you can do if you want to change the size of an object is use an XForm modifier and scale the gizmo. Scaling the gizmo isn't scaling the object. In fact, all it's doing is moving all of the vertices in the object to a new position using the gizmo container. Once I've sized it to the size I like, right-click, convert to editable spline again, which will remove the XForm from the stack. Add another one to just above the main control. This will control the mid-waist section. A third, this will handle the upper shoulder area. And a fourth up on top, and this will be for handling the head. The next thing we can do is align these controls to the bones in orientation. Change the local axis. And the reason we want to do that is we're going to be using orientation constraints to handle the spinal column. It's easiest if our control object has the same basic orientation to start with. If you'll notice the base one here, Z is up, Y is backwards, X is across. If I pick the bone it'll be controlling, Y is forward, Z is this way across, and X is down. So it's completely different. We pick this control, use the Align tool, and align it in orientation X, Y, and Z up to that base bone. The next two controls to set up properly, I want to align both of them to the base one. We want both of these controls actually to be in the same orientation. You'll find once we start using the orientation constraints, if you haven't done this, you'll start getting errors. Using the Align tool, I'm going to align them both to the base bone of the upper spine in orientation. And the head bone, I'm just going to align up to the nub bone at the top of the head. These controls are ready to be used now. Hooked up to the spinal column and control the character. If you find yourself reusing controls like this all the time, you can do several things to make it easier. One is to actually write them into a scripted tool set so you can drag and drop them onto the screen. I have done several that are available for download from my site that make it easier to actually be able to create these controls. This one even has the ability to be able to add text into it so you can drag out coins that have characters' names or part names added into them. The next step will be linking the objects together and zeroing out the controls so that we have a zero value to start with during animation. This will help the animators make more sense of their function curves because all of the curves will start at a value of 0 at the default pose, as opposed to having arbitrary values and spreading their function curves out in the curve editor. Let's start with the linking. It's going to be very straightforward. We'll start with the neck bone. We'll use the Select and Link tool. Link the neck bone to the nub bone at the top of the spinal column. We're going to link the upper spine and lower spine to the main control object. And we're going to link all of the control objects to the main control. If we select and move the main control now, This should move all the objects together. The control objects will be kind of free floating. As the character bends and flexes, all the controls will remain in the same place. You really need to make sure that they're far enough out from the character that the character isn't always bending and moving into them and burying them. This makes it just a little bit easier for the animators to select and be able to rotate them. The next step is going to be getting zero values for these controllers. Some of the controllers we may have to wire or use expressions to help drive some other part of the character. Just like for the animators, a zero value comes in very handy. If we know that the starting value is 0, we can use it as a multiplier, say for the rotation of another bone. Without that bone suddenly jumping to a new location, position, or rotation based on the arbitrary value it has. The best way to zero out rotations in Max is with the use of list controllers. List controllers tend to be very misunderstood in Max and not often used, even by intermediate and advanced people. A list controller basically allows you to be able to layer controllers one on top of another. So you can have multiple controllers controlling a position or rotation or any value in Max. In this case, I'm actually going to use a sphere as an example object to show you how this works. I'm going to place a sphere here in the scene. Its current value for position in X is 0 because it is currently sitting in the center of world space in X. Y is negative 46. Z is 88. The only way you could actually get a 0 value on this object currently would be if you were to move it all the way down to the center of world space here. Obviously this isn't what we want to do. The next way to do it is use a list controller. Currently right now for the position of this object, we only have one controller controlling it. It is a position XYZ controller breaking the tracks into the XYZ. We're going to select that controller, go to the Assign Controllers dialog, choose Position List, and say OK. That now adds a list controller and has kept the original controller as the first one. The next slot is blank right now with an available, saying that we can add more controllers. It has also added a new rollout to the motion panel, which basically lists all the controllers that will be controlling the position of this object and allow us to be able to change between them to see different sets of controls for each controller. In the available slot, now let's add a second controller. Back to the Assign Position controller. This time I'm going to use Position XYZ. And you can see now there's the first one, and now it's added a second one. So we actually have two controllers controlling the position of this object. In the Position List dialog rollout, we actually have the first one set as active. We know that by this little arrow here that actually shows that's the active controller, and it's also the one that's being displayed in these rollouts down here for the key info. Its value still is where we originally left it. So 0, or X is 0, Y is negative 46, and Z is 88. If we select the second controller and set it active, or you can just simply double click on it, you can see that the second controller has a value of 0 in X, 0 in Y, and 0 in Z. This is because list controllers are additive. Each controller adds on to the next. So this controller is holding the initial placement of the object, and the second controller actually simply adds on. So its starting value is going to be 0, 0, 0. Having it active also means that anytime we animate this sphere on the screen, that is the controller that will get the keys. All the others will not. Let's apply this to our control objects now. Max has a built-in tool for zeroing out objects in position and rotation. If you hold down Alt, right-click, bring up your quad menus, you can actually find Freeze Transform. in the upper left-hand quad menu. Choose the freeze transform. You'll get a message popping up saying freezing transform involves setting up another layer of controllers. You'll lose any constraints or animation that was applied to these controllers. Say yes. What this has done now is set up a list controller in the position and rotation of the object. It's also named the controllers for you conveniently so you can see them, what their purpose is. Frozen position is basically the original offset controller, and zero position is the first zero controller in the list. And it sets the second one active for you. As well as in the rotation, frozen rotation and zero Euler rotation. This is going to make it a lot easier to set the character up. We can now zero out all of the controls all at once by selecting them all, Alt, right click, freeze transform, and say yes. Now we have frozen transforms on all axes and zero values that we can start rigging with.